The journey to Australia for our great-great-grandmother Catherine was certainly different than Michael's experience. We do know from the paperwork that Michael and Catherine were not on the same ship to Australia. Chances are they came in different years. We also know that County Roscommon was hit pretty hard by the famine. During the 5 years of the famine, Roscommon lost over 30% of its population due to death and emigration. A high number of orphans came out of the County Roscommon. Orphans were often sent to Australia to find work as house servants. There was a labor shortage in Australia at this time, and this was a very common thing for orphans to be shipped off to Australia. So for somebody from Roscommon, the typical path of emigration would be leaving from the port of Dublin, possibly going to Liverpool or Plymouth, and then finally another ship would take them to Australia. Departing Plymouth, they would head out to the Atlantic Ocean, going around Africa again, and finally sailing into Australia. Let's zoom into Australia here. Typically, emigrant ships from Ireland would land in Sydney. Some of the cities here I'll point out. Melbourne is in the south, and Sydney is on the east coast of Australia. Particularly, immigrant ships would land. A lot of the ship registers say that they landed in Port Jackson, which is the main port in Sydney. It's basically this area right here. Ships would have to go around that little jutting out of land there. That was Fort Macquarie, right here. Otherwise, today it's known as the Sydney Opera House. The ships would dock at the main docks in Sydney Cove, and from there the ships would unload their passengers, and orphans from Ireland would be taken to the Hyde Park Barracks. It's a historical monument now there, but at the time it was a former prisoner barracks, which they repurposed for housing orphans. The orphans would stay at Hyde Park Barracks sometimes for several months, waiting for employment from Australian homeowners that were seeking help. They would come in and interview the girls and hire them if they found a fit. So we do know that Michael and Catherine arrived on separate ships, and both of them in the late 1840s. The next record that we have of them is when they got married on December 27th, 1852. They were married at St. Mary's Cathedral right here. And less than a year later, we do know that they had a son, Thomas, who was born in 1853. We know that because there's a baptismal record that was found. And the baptismal record says that Thomas was baptized at the parish of St. James. That's not to be confused with St. James Anglican Church on King Street, which is close by here. Chances are Thomas was baptized at St. Mary's Cathedral also. The parish of St. James is really a geographic area in the Hyde Park area right here. This is St. James Parish. So that's why the baptismal record is stated as such. And looking up information, that's a typical misconception that the Church of St. James is the same as the parish of St. James, which is totally not true. Another thing that we learned on the baptismal record is it stated that Catherine and Michael's abode was Victoria Street, and Victoria Street is located pretty close by here. It's this area right here. But that's really where the paper trail ends. We don't know much more about the years in Australia. And this is pretty much all we know at this point. The next record that we see of Michael and Catherine is when they arrive in 1854 in New York City with their son Thomas.